First of all, thank you to Kini Academy for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. And Sister Mary's presentation just now, as well as Tamina's presentation, was really interesting. And I learned so much from that. And I'm just like still, like when you get a lot of good information, you just sort of in short. But that was really good. Going back to my presentation, so today I'm going to talk about period poverty. So the first part of it is just defining what period poverty is, and then we're going to talk about gender and inequality and how that spreads, or we can see that in the public space, and then how do we sort of reconcile and address these kinds of issues. So when we talk about period poverty, sometimes there's a bit of a confusion as to what period poverty is. And that's the interesting bit, because I think it sort of catches people's attention enough to get them to listen to what period poverty looks like or what it means. Essentially, period poverty is the inability of a menstruating person or female body to access menstrual health. So usually what we see being published, especially recently in Malaysia, which it's sort of catching on with mainstream media, is on the lack of one element, which is the menstrual product. So poverty as in inequality or wealth inequality that results in an inability or lack to access of the menstrual product like sanitary pads or tampons or a menstrual cup for people to manage their menstruation. But that's actually just one part of what period poverty is. So when we're talking about period poverty, we actually want to cover everything around menstrual health, what does not allow women or not give access to being able to manage menstrual health. So usually I'll highlight 4 things. Number 1 is the product. Not having access to the products that can allow women or girls to manage their menstrual health. So it could be any absorbent and safe product. Okay, number 2 would be the wash facilities. Wash facilities is clean water, access to toilets, access to sanitation, disposal management of the products. Say, for example, if we're using disposable sanitary pad, can we dispose of the product properly? And then we're looking also at hand wash. So that's the second element. The third would be knowledge. Or information about menstruation. So do they know about what menstruation is, that it's normal, that it's a cycle, what to expect, and things like that. And then finally would be privacy. So these are the 4 things that I usually mention. But if we look at the slide, it only covers the 2 things, which is knowledge and materials and facilities. So in order to ensure that women and girls have access to menstrual health, we're actually looking at a few other things, which is the health services and resources. That means the sort of social connection that girls and women have access to if they're not feeling well. For example, if they're going through endometriosis, like excessive pain relating to menstruation, do they know what it is, and can they get support and help for that? Or any other forms of disorders. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room is the stigma around periods or around menstruation. So ensuring that women and girls have access to positive and respectful environment. This is another hot issue in Malaysia, what we're seeing around issues relating to period spot checks, which we can discuss a little bit more later on, about girls being checked for having periods at school. And then, of course, we have the issue of inclusivity. These are looking at the impacts of certain stigmas, certain ideas around menstruation and how that affects lives of women and girls. So including whether they are excluded from certain spaces, whether they're restricted from doing certain things, whether they're being discriminated for having menstruation. For example, they are labeled as dirty, or they're labeled as emotionally unwell and things like that. And then, of course, any form of violence or coercions that are related to menstruation. And then this would have an impact on different parts of women's lives and girls' lives. For example, not being able to manage their menstruation could mean that they don't have access to education. So they don't have proper products to help them manage their menstruation, or the schools do not have access to clean water and things like that. So that means that they don't have access to other life opportunities. And then that could also look at things relating to work, or women with endometriosis might not have the same kind of opportunities to go back to work. And then we're looking at other issues relating to politics. For example, the idea that women are more emotional because we have our menstruation and things like that, therefore not being given access to or not given the same opportunities to take on certain roles. So inclusivity is also another thing that we also have to discuss when we're talking about menstrual health and discrimination in gender. So how is it that at any given time, it's estimated that there are 800 million of us menstruating, and we menstruate for 30 or so years of our lives, but we don't really talk much about it, or we still don't do enough about it? So what happens is, when we're talking about menstruation, we have what we call a culture of concealment. So generally, we don't listen or we don't hear about people talking about menstruation. We don't address menstruation. And even more so in our region, it's quite a taboo and stigmatized topic. We hush about it. We whisper about it. We give different names to menstruation. We give different names to sanitary pads. We give different names to anything relating to it, so as to silence the conversation, so as to make sure that it's invisible. Nobody knows who and when somebody is menstruating. If you're in a discussion or if you're in a roundtable meeting, you don't know if your colleague is menstruating. If she had a leakage, even then you wouldn't know, or she would have to hide it. Or we see girls at school, if there's a leakage, there's a big process, or there's a lot of processes in trying to manage the leakage, so as to make sure that nobody knows what has happened and keep everything silent and quiet. So there's a lot of silencing and invisibility around menstruation. So this makes sure that it's neatly and tightly put away, that nobody talks about it. And then we have the stigma and taboo relating to menstruation as well. The idea that the menstruating body is dirty, the idea that the menstruating body is problematic, the blood is dirty blood, for example, that women who are menstruating are not in a good state, whether it's emotionally. Sometimes in some cultures, we believe that women who are menstruating are weaker spiritually, or are more prone to getting disturbed by different creatures and things like that. So there's a lot of different stigmas and taboos, and this is also very much related to where we are at and the cultures that we're looking at around menstruation as well. And then more often than not, when we're talking about menstruation, if we're not talking about stigma and taboos, we're looking at it from a hygiene lens. So what happens with hygiene lens is menstruation is conceived as something that's a disease, or something that has to do with cleanliness. So we have to ensure that everything is clean. So often in a public setting, women and girls hide their menstruation so that they can appear clean, and they can appear that they're not sick, so that they are deserving of being in a public setting. So we have this package of culture of concealment that sort of stops us from doing a lot of things, stops us from having conversations around menstruation. And why is it that it continues to happen? So would suggest that we have a culture of concealment imperative, that women and girls learn from a very young age, and we internalize certain ideas about menstruation. So ideas around stigma and taboos, ideas around silence and invisibility, and ideas around cleanliness and health. And through my research in Malaysia, so we interview young girls as well at the beginning of their menstruation up until more than 10 cycles. And then when they are much older, to see how they experience menstruation and how they come up with ideas around practices, ideas about hygiene. So we're definitely noticing the internalizing of these values, or the internalizing of these practices, and what we call the imperative, to ensure that we don't talk about it. So even in a setting where we're running the focus group discussions with these young girls, it's harder for them to speak up, because they have internalized it so well that the first response is always to say shame. Like in Malay, they'd say malu. Like, it's so shameful to even talk about it, to talk about how they're managing it, to talk about what's happening to them, to ask questions about it. So it is so embedded that it has been taught to girls and women from a very young age, and then it goes on for a long time. So it's no wonder that even though half of us menstruate, and in some countries in the ASEAN region, more than half of the population are women, we still don't talk about menstruation. We still don't talk about issues relating to menstruation because of the strength of the culture of concealment, or the concealment imperative, where we've sort of agreed not to talk about it, and we hold on to it, and we teach others, and we silence others if they say like they're menstruating, or they're showing that they're menstruating. We teach them not to do it, or we help them in covering things up. So it sort of perpetuates this idea of concealment. So then what happens when we have the culture of concealment, which is part of the conversation around gender inequality, and that meets with wealth inequality? So this is where the conversation about period poverty happens. So we have this widening gap of wealth inequality that happens a lot in countries that are developing or progressing rapidly. And then we have high levels of urbanization. So we find that we have a population of urban poors, and then at the same time, there is a distinct separation or differentiation between the urban and the rural population, right? So we find that a lot of things happen in these regions that revolves around wealth inequalities. And so when we meet the intersection of wealth inequality and gender inequality, we know that there are even less conversations that talk about how women or girls are impacted by these kind of inequalities. So in the case of Malaysia, our research is looking at urban poor young girls. So it's a new population of urban poor, and it's a growing population of urban poor. And even more so with the pandemic, we find that a lot more people are affected by the cost of living in the city. And then when we talk to girls and women about menstruation, it does not come up at the priority of things that people think about when they're thinking about surviving through the pandemic and through the challenges of, the economic challenges. So one of the interesting things that we find is that with urban poverty, it takes on a unique kind of, it's different. And I think it's hard for the public to notice that, because the idea of poverty is so embedded that we want to see a particular look of poverty. And with period poverty, it has been somewhat the same when we're talking about reporting around period poverty. Our idea of poverty is almost always, there's this picture in our head about what it should look like. But when we're talking about urban poverty, it looks a bit different. So when we started our research, we did wonder if whether or not period poverty exists. And that's a question that I get a lot. Is that real? Is it something that we are still facing in 2021? And it is a question that I had to ask myself in the beginning as well. But if people experience poverty, and because women at the same time are experiencing gender inequality, there is a very high chance that it exists. It's just that we don't see it, or it's being covered up. So the first instance that we found out, or that I found out about period poverty, was in meeting with a homeless lady that was asking for a sanitary kit. So we were giving out food, but she asked, do you have sanitary pads? That just struck me. And I think that's definitely my privilege, not having to have to think about that at all. But that got me looking through things and trying to find, and I couldn't find anything, whether it's in academia or in reporting. There was like 2 reports maybe in the last 10 years about period poverty in Malaysia. And even then it was very short write-ups about people giving out sanitary pads, and that was it. So when we started our research with urban poor young girls, which I got from a report that there were girls who were missing out on school because they didn't have access to sanitary pad, I wondered if I wasn't going to find anything. So in the first focus group that we did with the girls, it felt like I wasn't going to find anything. I checked the boxes. They had access to water. They had access to sanitary pads. They were taught at school about menstruation. But it was until we listened to the recordings again that we realized, no, it looked like they had them. But when we listened again, they had to share the sanitary pad with their family members. For example, in some of the cases, we found that the mothers would buy a bag or a few packets at the beginning of the month of sanitary pads, and they might have a larger family with sometimes 5 to 9 girls in the same family. So what happens is they have to share the sanitary pad, and that's not enough, obviously. So what happens is they've learned to take what you can get. So it's like a first come, first serve kind of setting, unfortunately. But they were jovial about it. It wasn't like a sad, the story of poverty, like we don't have enough, so it's really difficult. They were just happy about it. They're like, oh, if you don't get it, it's too bad, and they laugh about it. That's just going to be awkward for you. What happens if you don't go to school when you don't have sanitary pad? The teachers would send you home. Then we started noticing that it was a whole ecosystem that allowed for this to happen, that young girls who are children essentially under the care of their parents didn't get access to enough sanitary pad. They did have some, but it wasn't enough. They had to prolong the use of the sanitary pads that they had. So instead of using it for the stipulated time, they would extend the use so as to not be wasteful. This idea of being wasteful. And then also when they went to school, nobody was checking on whether or not the school facilities had good access to water flow. The bins were cleared out, that they had bins to throw out their sanitary pads, that they were comfortable enough to change their sanitary pads while at school. So what happened is they did miss out on school, and on days where they don't have sanitary pads, they would go home and the teachers would allow for them to go home. And then they were not comfortable to change the sanitary pads at home, at school, even though they had them. So what they do is they don't participate in certain types of activities that will allow them, that would make them move more. So they would sit in and choose not to participate in certain things. And that was also allowed, and given that that's not a problem, there wasn't support anywhere around those things. And they didn't, and even though they did have a class or a session about menstruation, it didn't give them enough information about what they needed to know. And it was always set up in a very awkward kind of situation, that they didn't really learn about what the cycle was, and to go back and ask was not something that they had access to. So they didn't really have access to ask again about their menstrual cycle. So we noticed that, okay, we have a problem here, but it doesn't look like what we think it looked like. It looks like, at least for the urban poor young girls. And then we started talking to NGOs and NGIs who have been working on period poverty, and we noticed that in different segments of our societies, it doesn't look the same. So in really rural, remote areas in Malaysia, we have problems in all areas because they're so far removed. So they don't have access to sanitary pads, and they don't have access to cloth pads. They don't have access to tampons. They just don't have access to products. And in some places, there's no access to clean water, sanitation, toilets, privacy, and they don't learn about menstruation. So some of them would be scolded for having menstruation early because that was problematic for their family. They were taken out of school when they started menstruating, and things like that. So the severity of these cases were much more. So they would have to use, or they would have to resort to extreme measures of, for example, from completely not using anything and just letting the blood leak altogether, or putting coconut husk in old socks, or borrowing old cloth, or they would use the same cloth that they would rotate with their family members. So that's definitely not safe for them. So we find that these are some of the differences that we find between the rural and remote areas. And then we have those with different identities, or the intersectionality of the identities, the marginalized groups of refugees, stateless girls and women would experience different things. So there was definitely that gap where we've not taken the time to understand how women experience menstrual health management and our lives, and what we're doing as a society in order to make sure that women have access to this, and how many women or girls are affected by period poverty. So that's something that we don't see because of the concealment and silencing as well. That's the big elephant in the room in terms of trying to have these conversations is very challenging. And then at the same time, we know that nobody's looking at it, or there's not enough people looking at it. And so a lot of girls and women who experience period poverty do not know that they're experiencing period poverty, and they do not know how to get help for it, because it's really embarrassing or it's really shameful to reach out and get support for that. Okay. So in the public space, what happens is we live in a patriarchal society. So the women body that, or the female body that menstruates is not really welcomed in the society or in the public space. And we can see this visibly in a lot of the examples that I've already given just now. So when we're talking about the menstruating body, more often than not, it is framed or it is perceived as dirty, whether it is dirty, physically dirty, or whether it is considered spiritually or culturally dirty. And that there is this idea of women being weak because women menstruate, or they're weak while they are menstruating, that menstruation is an illness, or that women are experiencing illness, and that it's shameful. And women menstruating and women speaking about their menstruation or the menses itself brings discomfort to others. So the idea of speaking about it, or the idea of looking at women leakage during menstruation, makes other people uncomfortable, and therefore does not or should not be placed in the public space. So when we're talking about menstrual concealment, we find that concealing it is better for women because of these reasons, because of these perceptions and framing around menstruation makes it better for women to choose to conceal it. So it further strengthens the idea of the concealment imperative, that we feel that it's better for us to not talk about it, whether it's socially, whether politically, to bring up issues relating to policy changes and things like that, or in our personal lives to tell others, because sometimes there's this constant idea that menstruating women, for example, are more emotional, so we shouldn't talk about things, we don't bring up these issues and things like that. So these are just some of the examples. All right, so we want to look at how period poverty looks like in public spaces and how we can start to address them. So what we've seen so far in terms of reporting of period poverty, not just in Malaysia, but globally, has always been about the really severe cases of period poverty. Not to say that they're not important to highlight, but that gives us the illusion that those are the only ones we want to talk about. So whenever we discuss period poverty in Malaysia, I find that journalists or reporters often ask, like, how severe it is. Tell us, like, the really serious cases. So always chasing for really severe cases, like, oh, how many women are choosing to get pregnant instead of going through menstruation because they cannot afford it. So I feel that we really need to relook at the problem. Isn't it enough that women should be able to manage our menstruation safely and healthily? Isn't that the basic level that we need? That it shouldn't have to be the extreme that women have to choose to starve themselves so that they don't have menstruation for the month, or that they have to choose pregnancy over menstruation. Isn't it enough, or isn't it the bare minimum that all women should be able or be given the right to manage our menstruation properly? So in addressing these issues, we need to look at how menstruation or how period poverty affects women and girls in the different public spaces that we are in. So we're talking about education and work. We're definitely looking at facilities and access to products. So whether or not we have considered the facilities are enough for young girls and for women to manage our menstruation. So this includes access to water, access to space. In some cultures, different practices around menstruation might require different types of facilities. So that would be something that we would need to think about. And we want to ensure that people have the comfort to manage their menstruation safely and also comfortably in those spaces, that there is privacy for women and girls to do that. And then we're also looking at access to products. whether or not they have products. So we want to check whether the toilets have extra products for women and girls to have access to, right? And then we also want to know how well, this is about gender sensitivity, and I think we've highlighted this before with the previous speakers as well, being sensitive to the needs of menstruating bodies in spaces where we are in. So in education setting, are teachers trained to understand what these are, whether or not the teachers who deliver these messages are checking. So we find that sometimes there are, with schools, we know that in Malaysia at least, the education around menstruation usually would separate the girls and the boys. So we don't talk about menstruation together. So boys have different ideas about menstruation and girls have different ideas about menstruation. And the problem sort of stems here as well. The understanding of menstruation is not in a safe and clear kind of way, and therefore the conversation around menstruation is also not being put in a way that is safe and healthy. So we find that there's a lot of bullying relating to menstruation in the school setting itself, where boys are teasing girls about their menstruation, shaming them for leakage, or teasing them to say that, oh, you have menstruation, you're leaking now, even though they're not leaking. So we have issues like that that are ongoing, even in 2020, when as it somehow, is surprising for a lot of people, but these are things that are still ongoing. And the same is also happening in the workplace, that women or girls or women are treated differently for having menstruation, or women have to conceal their menstruation even though we're going through pain or discomfort, that women do not feel comfortable enough to excuse ourselves to manage our menstruation. And then we have questions around cultural and religious spaces. And this may be different depending on where we are, depending on our country, and depending also on the religious practices that we have. So it will be something that we want to explore perhaps, or something that you want to look into as well, in understanding the context of those spaces, because there are different beliefs, and there are also different practices that are being imposed on girls, or that are taught to girls about menstruation, and it may not be true, and it may be something that is really excluding them from certain spaces, or really discriminatory in some ways. For example, in the context of the Muslim community in Malaysia around washing of the sanitary pad, it's a very sensitive topic, right? About washing of the disposable sanitary pad. It's something that is so cultural, and something that is so strongly internalized by women and girls. And this is one of the research areas that we're looking at as well, to wash the sanitary pad. If it's not being washed, then women or girls can be disturbed by spiritual creatures, because the blood is considered dirty. So religiously, there is no evidence for this, but it is continually perpetuated within the culture. And so it causes a lot of psychological distress to girls as well, in terms of trying to manage their menstruation, and then the disciplining that comes with that, and their understanding of themselves and their menstruating bodies. We also have issues relating to the political sphere. How often is it that we get to push for policies that relate to managing menstrual health without it being taken lightly, or without it being something that's not taken too seriously, or not taken seriously enough, and not just a woman's issue? And we want to talk about how we can streamline the initiatives and efforts around period poverty, and how we can talk about it seriously, to look at the potential life outcomes of girls and women within our society. And then, of course, the general public areas. We want to make sure we bring into the conversations of public toilets, whether public toilets are safe spaces for girls and women to manage their menstruation, whether there are clear ideas around what is needed and how we can cater to the safety of girls and women in public spaces. All right, so the role of advocacy, activism, and media in addressing issue of period poverty, especially in the public space. So I think we take on like a 3-step kind of process. So the first one is definitely raising awareness, and then promoting for policies that are tailored to what is needed in each region and in each country, and then monitoring those policies to ensure that there is sustainability, and that the policies are something that's long-term. And I think this is something that Tamina and Sister Mary highlighted as well. We have policies and we can come up with great policies, but we really need to check the implementation of these policies, whether they're good or not. So advocacy, activism, and the media really plays a strong role in all of these three areas. And I want to give an example about how period poverty is being addressed in different parts, including Malaysia. So I was really fortunate to be speaking to colleagues in New Zealand who addressed period poverty and how that translated into policy implementation as well, and giving out free sanitary kits to school-going children. So it's always about collaboration. It's always about organizing ourselves together. So collaborating with different parties and talking to each other means that we can work together, and we can discuss things, and we can learn from each other. And so that's really an important aspect of how we've addressed period poverty, or we are addressing period poverty in Malaysia as well. So to talk to each other, not just within our area, so not just in academia, for someone like me, just talking about research about period poverty, but also getting to know the grassroots actors and talking to them about what's happening, what's working. And then, of course, meeting up with the media and talking to people in media and addressing how we can frame the discussion around period poverty. So that is the very basic kind of collaboration that we should be able to have in trying to make these kind of changes around period poverty, or any women's issues, I suppose, that we're trying to bring or to push forward. So with the beginning conversation is just raising awareness. And I think that's something that we're still working on in Malaysia, is trying to make sure that people know what period poverty is and to understand how it affects women's and girls' lives. And I think the most important part during this awareness kind of campaign is to make sure that the framing around period poverty is correct. And I'm really scared that period poverty is almost always framed as something that's extreme. And in Malaysia in particular, the story of women getting pregnant because they don't have sanitary pad, I'm really trying hard to make sure that that's not the face of period poverty. You know, that we continue to talk about period poverty, including all menstruating bodies, in considering how all menstruating bodies are affected by the different areas or the different elements that may not be available to all of us. So not just framing it as something that's extreme, so it's easy for us to sort of let go. As soon as we know that, okay, people have, you know, it's not something believable, it's not something relatable, it's not affecting enough people for us to care. Trying to move those conversations and trying to make sure that we do things consciously. And I think Tamina brought this just now on how things are being reported, what's getting reported, whether there is an understanding of the issue is also really important. And then we move on to promoting things. What are we looking for? What do we need to do next? So the collaboration between the different groups is really important in ensuring that we have a good voice. And the voice is something that we've sort of discussed together, and we know what we want to push for within our country or within our nation. So this goes also for other nations and other countries who may have different challenges. You know, in some countries, maybe it's the wash facilities that you want to push forward first. You know, we don't want to have a copycat kind of policies just because we see a lot of reporting of period poverty in a particular country that talks about products, then we, you know, sort of hop onto that and just pull that into our country. And that's not something we really need to begin with. So we have to tailor our advocacy, our activism to what is important to our people, and therefore we need to understand our people first. So that's really important. And then once we get policy changes, we have to make sure that we monitor those policy changes in terms of its implementation, whether it's reaching the target groups that we are hoping that it will, and how that's changing and how that's improving the situation in the long run. So that's really important as well. All right, so if we want to open the conversation and keep the conversation going, we really need to understand what's happening in our region and what's happening within the context of things. So just like I said, if we look at, for example, countries who have passed laws or who have passed or given policies to give out free sanitary kits or address period poverty, they have different needs, so they address them differently, right? So I can give an example. For example, in Malaysia, if we give free sanitary kits only in the form of a disposable sanitary pad, it's not always going to be good, because in really rural, remote areas where there is no disposal management, which is the facility part of menstrual health, what happens is women cannot dispose their sanitary pads properly. So we've had NGOs who have given out disposable sanitary pads in really rural, remote areas. And what happens is when they come back next time, we find floating sanitary pads in the waters. So that's not helpful for anybody. So we need to understand that it's not always a one size fits all solution. So we really have to understand the context in which we're bringing these solutions, right? And then we also have to talk about the conversation around the culture of our setting. Another example of product is, for example, we want to go for a more sustainable kind of route, right? To use a menstrual cup. So essentially a menstrual cup is a silicone cup that can be used for a long time. So it can be used up to 5 to 7 years. So if you want to think about like sustainability and economical kind of things, you might want to consider, oh, why don't we give a menstrual cup to all girls and women? You know, you could quickly fundraise that, or you could quickly give them that. But the menstrual cup needs to be inserted. And if we're looking at the cultures around virginity, then there's a lot of conversations that needs to be had, and education and support that needs to be had. So it's not just about structures, it's not just about giving out the product, but it has to also come with education and changing the framework. So maybe we want to consider what are the understandings of culture around those contexts as well, and whether it's sustainable or not. The other thing, for example, with using cup is we have to consider whether or not they have access to clean water to wash those cups. So it's not really simplistic kind of policies that we want to push for, that we've seen, like, for example, Scotland has done it and given out free pads for everybody, that we just want to hop on board and deliver. You know, there are people who need it and they need it fast, but that shouldn't be the only solution. And that's not the sustainable solution. So in opening up the conversation, we need to take the time to understand the context within our region and within our country, and the kind of diversity that we have in our society. Who are the women that we have in our society? Who are the girls that we have? And what kind of infrastructure, facilities that we have? What are the cultures around menstruation? What are the cultures around gender? Access to certain facilities or access to certain spheres of life, whether it's social, whether it's religious, whether it's political. So these are things that we have to talk about. We cannot just, have one conversation around giving free pads for everybody. Those conversations need to happen, and we have to allow for those conversations to happen. So I want to just highlight the Malaysian case, which has been quite exciting. I think, there's still a lot of things we need to do. There's still a lot more things for us to push for. But I think what is optimistic and exciting about the Malaysian case is how fast things have progressed. And I think Timina highlighted this before. Prior to 2017, we had maybe a handful of reporting about period poverty, and that was just like one short article about an initiative to give out free sanitary pad, or an initiative of social enterprise coming out with the idea of one buy one, and you give out one sanitary pad to another, for example, an unfortunate or underprivileged girl. But what's happened since the pandemic, especially, is the conversations around menstruation, around period poverty that's happened. And I think a lot of this has to do with how some media channels have played on the issue. And for the first time, we have had the conversation around period poverty happen not only in independent media, but also on mainstream media. So we've managed to get through to radio, we've managed to get through to TV, we've managed to get through to print paper, digital media. So that's really a breakthrough in terms of speaking about menstruation in platforms. So it's an optimistic perspective to think about how even within the culture of concealment, we manage to penetrate these things, and we manage to bring issues that are important out there if there is political will and if there is understanding and willingness also from those or from those of you who are working in this area to highlight and to push for these issues. And the journalists that I spoke with, especially at the beginning of this, earlier last year and earlier this year, they had to fight for these issues to be highlighted. And just like Tamina said, they had to ask and they had to push that these issues are being reported. So that was really something beautiful to see. And then at the beginning, it was just because in Malaysia, we speak different languages. So we have media in different languages. So in the beginning, it was just English and Malay media. And then later on, we got into Sinchir Daily, which is a Mandarin media, to talk about period poverty. So that was really good because that expanded who were going to read about it and how they were going to read it. And, you know, the framing around period poverty, and also giving or unpacking the concealment of menstruation. There's one here is our former Minister of Religious Affairs with the sanitary pad, and I think that's a very powerful picture as well, given the taboo and stigma around menstruation. So I think that's a really powerful reporting about menstruation and the role of men in menstruation. Otherwise, we always see the same kind of pictures and depictions around menstruation, around poverty. So having different kind of depictions, having different kinds of conversations is important. Even though we see really good progress, these are just some of the reportings. We've had even more reportings after in the last year around period poverty. So that's very exciting. But what I find is that it's always similar kind of reporting that happens around menstruation, that we're looking at severe cases, or we're really looking at cases which is like I said earlier, you know, the kind of cases that we don't normally find, and we want to talk about that rather than talking about the basic needs that are not met. And that should be serious enough for us to highlight it. It doesn't have to be, you know, the worst kind of cases that we bring into the media, that it's really bad, that half of the population cannot get access to our basic rights, should already be newsworthy. It should already be something that we constantly talk about. And then we find that there was a policy change, or we find that there is government kind of conversation that we didn't see before and we had not seen before. So I think we have to acknowledge that conversations not only on social media, which plays a big role, and it's something that is much stronger now because largely because of the pandemic and also the rise of social movements online, that we find that it's also moved into mainstream media, and that creates awareness around period poverty. And with that awareness, we found that there was more conversations that were being had within the parliament, and there were more conversations that were being had by parliamentarians, by politicians. And then we saw the first release or the first budget allocation for period poverty, and that it's to be given to teenage girls. So it was to be given to poor teenage girls. So it's not all women, not all women categories, and we want to make sure that we address these issues next. We want to look at the implementations of the budget in giving out free hygiene kits, and why they're giving it out to girls and not all women, and things like that. But at the same time, it's progress. It's something that we look forward to. It shows us that it's definitely doable if we give enough, you know, attention to it, and we highlight it enough. It's something that can happen, and it's something that we want to continue to push for, and we want to continue to talk about. Okay, I think that sort of wraps things up for me, and I hope that's we can continue the conversation, and there'll be questions later on.